Welcome to this edition of Inside Judicial Watch. I'm your host, Jerry Dunleavy. Today we're going to be discussing the tragic shooting that occurred in Parkland, Florida, resulting in the death of 17 people. We're going to discuss the leadership failures and the strategic failures, the policy failures that occurred at the local level, at the Broward County Sheriff's Office, at the federal level, at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and elsewhere. Failures that, if they'd been avoided, may have resulted in the shooting not occurring. Joining me today to lend his insight and his expertise is Mr. Bill Marshall, a senior investigator here at Judicial Watch. Thank you very much for joining me again today, sir.
Happy to be back, Jerry.
So, Mr. Marshall, you wrote a pretty interesting piece, sort of going into sort of the background on some of the issues that may have been interplaying, that may have helped lead to these series of failures. And I'd like to hear you, if you would, give me a bit of a background on your piece and explain kind of where you're coming from, so that we can start to get at, you know, what helped to lead to this tragic event. Right.
Well, in a prior life, I used to do investigations of all sorts. I did a lot of life insurance investigations over the years. About 10 or 12 years ago, I investigated a plane crash, a very unfortunate incident which occurred in Georgia, I believe. There was a family traveling from the Midwest to their vacation home in the South. And the father, who was the pilot and the owner of the plane, had his wife and his 3 children aboard with him. And midway across the country, or at some point on their flight, they encountered inclement weather, which forced him to divert the aircraft. And a series of errors ensued. When he began to run low on fuel, so he had to find an airstrip somewhere. He located a small airstrip that was fog shrouded. And unfortunately, his altimeter had failed, and they were relying on a handheld GPS, a Garmin or something that his son had with him, to estimate their altitude. And as he was coming in, circling the small airstrip, one of his engines cut out on his plane. It was a 2-engine plane, and the plane lost power, and it veered nosed into the ground, sadly killing the father and mother, and badly injuring their 3 children. And the reason I bring that up was because that case reminded me very much of the Parkland shooting. It was as I spoke to aviation experts about that crash investigation years ago, I remember something they told me, and that is that most airline crashes occur as a result of what they call cascading failure. That is, in all interdependent systems, much like you have in a school system, one error can lead to another. It's a major disaster like an airplane crash or a mass school shooting doesn't generally occur out of the blue. It's usually the result of a series of failures of components in a system. One failure leading to another failure, leading to another failure. So I use that analogy, my recollection of that airplane crash I investigated, and compared it to what happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And in fact, I consulted a friend who's a commercial airline pilot and flight instructor about, I ran my analogy by him, and he said, that's a great analogy, not only for the obvious reasons, because, we see a series of systemic failures which lead to the ultimate catastrophe. But he even compared it, he sort of drew out my analogy by saying that the evolution of our society is very similar to the evolution of aircraft itself. Aircraft have become increasingly remotely operated. That is, autopilot is used much more extensively than it was in the early days of aviation, when you had a stick and rudder pedals, and you had to be much more situationally aware as a pilot of your surroundings and what your aircraft was doing. You were a much more central part of the flight control mechanisms. But as the airline aviation industry has evolved, airplanes have become much more reliant on automated systems and autopilot. And sometimes, in these days, the pilot can become so removed from the operation of the aircraft that a disaster can develop without his even realizing it, and sometimes until it's too late to correct for the problem, and then the aircraft goes down. In a similar way, our society has become much more dependent on sort of these overarching institutions, schools, police departments, school systems, and policies that they've kind of removed control from parents in a lot of ways. Parents have become, unfortunately, and I say this as the parent of 3 grown children myself, I'm very familiar with school systems and my own children's involvement in them. And there's a tendency to cede control to the school systems and to the police departments, and kind of assuming, in society in general, and kind of assuming that our kids are going to be okay and that they're going to be taken care of. The problem is when you have, and we can discuss this further on, but when you have social engineers who think that they can control our children's lives and institute policies which can cause disasters to occur, like we saw in Parkland, for reasons we can discuss, related to the Obama administration and certain policies that they pursued, which I believe lay at the heart of what happened in Parkland.
So I mean, it does seem like a lot of people were, as your analogy alluded to, on autopilot when it came to Nicholas Cruz, the shooter. All of the red flags, all of the warning signs that were there, and yet nothing ever seemed to happen as a result. I mean, that is a classic sort of autopilot mentality. Would you be able to start to get into some specifics here about what you think were some of the policies that Broward County was following that helped sort of lay the framework and lay the ground for a clearly troubled student like this to send up all of these red flags, and yet nothing happened to stop him until it was too late.
Right. I think that anyone looking at this situation in Parkland has to be astounded at the number of failures that occurred by the school district, by the Broward County Sheriffs Office, by the FBI, by the Florida Department of, I think it's called Family and Children's Services, that also looked into this kid when he was, before he went on this rampage. And yet, despite all these red flags, these are almost like signal flares that this kid was sending off. He was able to sort of skate under the radar and eventually pull off this disaster. And a lot of it, as I've dug into this issue, more and more, and I've sent out, I think at this point, 6 records requests to various Florida agencies, and I'll also be sending out more to the U.S. Department of Education, because now I'm learning about their increasing culpability in this disaster. Back in 2011, the Broward County school system brought in a new superintendent named Robert Runcie. He had worked for the Obama administration's Secretary of the Department of Education, Arne Duncan, back when Arne Duncan was the CEO of the Chicago Public School System. Robert Runcie had been his chief of staff. So in 2011, when Arne Duncan is the U.S. Secretary of the Department of Education, Robert Runcie is appointed superintendent of the Broward County school system. Broward County had the highest number of arrests in 2011-2012 of any Florida school district. I think it was 1,067. What it appears what Runcie's mission was, whether of his own initiative or at the urging of Arne Duncan and Barack Obama, was to get that number of arrests down. So the following year, only 392 arrests were made. So it was a 66% drop in the number of arrests, in-school arrests in the Broward County school system. And it wasn't because there was any less criminal or disruptive behavior occurring, unacceptable behavior by students. It was simply that the school system had signed on to this program called the PROMISE program. It stood for Preventing Recidivism Through Opportunities, Mentoring, Intervention, Support, and Education, right? Mm-hmm. They had to come up with a name that would form the nice acronym PROMISE, right? Typical government bureaucracy thinking. So they establish this program, and the idea behind it is that when a kid is disruptive or committing criminal acts in school, you don't want to have him arrested, but you want to refer him for counseling, right? So as a result of this program, Broward County or the Broward School District made a conscious effort not to arrest children who should have been arrested, right? Like this kid, Nicholas Cruz. I mean, just looking at the number of, the police log of calls that were made to the Broward County Sheriff's Office about this kid and his brother as well, 45.
And what's interesting about the 45 calls, before we dive into them, is that I believe that the sheriff, Scott Israel, initially had been insisting that there were maybe only something like 23 calls.
Right,
that
approximately
were made.
half, right.
But then it turned out that maybe there were 22 other calls that have been made, bringing it to at least 45 that we know of.
Right, and in most of these cases that we see from the log, no written report was prepared apparently by the sheriff's office. You had domestic disturbance, child elderly abuse calls, domestic disturbance. This was probably, it seems like the most dysfunctional family in all of Broward County, the Nicholas Cruz's family. And yet he's never arrested in all of these problems that he's causing both at home and at school. And as I point out in my article, federal gun law should have prevented his purchasing any firearms if he had been arrested for a felony or even a misdemeanor domestic violence charge, which should have occurred in all of these multitude of calls that were made about this kid, which would have prevented him from buying these firearms. In January 2017, more than a year before, or January of 2017, rather, more than a year before his shooting rampage, he was, Broward County was called to the school after he assaulted another student. That assault should have arrested, but for this Promise program, should have resulted in his arrest. Had that occurred, the subsequent 10 purchases he made of firearms, according to CNN, would not have occurred. Okay. Now that's not to say that he couldn't have used some other device, a car to run people over, or a knife to stab people, or something like that.
Right.
Had he gone off.
There's no magic. There's no magic bullet here.
Right, and that's a whole nother discussion. I don't think this case is about guns at all, personally. I mean, I think that a gun is just an instrument, it's just a tool, right? People, the worst mass murder of school children in this country occurred with a bomb in I think it was 1927 in Bath, Michigan, when 38 children were killed and 6 adults or something. So a gun is just an inanimate object. It's an instrument, it's a tool, So the focus is entirely misplaced by the left in this country when they want to focus on gun control and taking away the rights of law-abiding citizens, kind of constitutional right, when the focus should really be on the systems that were in place to stop this kid, which completely failed on all levels, federal, state, and local. Because
the point that you're making is that on record, we have the police knowing that he was making violent threats, that he was committing some sort of violent acts at home, that he committed some sort of assault at school, and if at any point he had been charged with something and those laws had been enforced, purchasing guns just would not have been a possibility for him. Right, and exactly. And that's not to say, again, that he couldn't have stolen somebody else's weapon and shot the school up or something like that, but at least that aspect of this story, wouldn't have played out, presumably. And I should point out that I don't think this can be really overstated, the culpability I see of the Obama administration in this story, right? Basically, the Promise program was created out of the same ideology that drives the Black Lives Matter movement. And that is this. 70% of kids who are arrested in school are blacks or Latinos. The Obama administration and Eric Holder, Barack Obama and Eric Holder, and for that matter, I think Arnie Duncan, viewed everything through a racial lens, right? They didn't think that the 70% of the kids who were being arrested, being black and Latino, had anything to do, it seems, with the underlying behavior for which they were arrested, committing crimes and being disruptive and that sort of thing. They viewed it as
racist teachers, racist white teachers, implicit racism. This is the same thinking that goes into the Black Lives Matters movement, which is that cops don't shoot, black people because they're guilty of posing a threat to either the cops or other people. No, they shoot them because the cops are inherently racist and they're targeting black people. It's a very really perverse way of looking at both our law enforcement officers and our teachers now. They essentially extended this kind of thinking from the cops to law enforcement to teachers. And the guy who's done terrific work on this is Max Eden. He's a scholar at the Manhattan Institute. And he wrote an article on this, I believe, in November of 2017 for National Review, which I commend to everybody. Breitbart has also recently done great work on this. 2 days ago, they wrote an article called Broward County Likely Inspiration for Obama's School Discipline Policy to Report Fewer Arrests and Suspensions. So what they argue in Breitbart, what Max Eden argues, I think probably correctly, is that this Robert Runcie, school superintendent, Robert Runcie down in Broward County, is very connected to the Obama administration, and he was almost the pilot. Broward County became almost a pilot school district to test this program, this Promise program, to artificially stop arresting kids who should be arrested. And in fact, Barack Obama hailed Broward County as the national model for reducing the school-to-prison pipeline population. And this is why I think that Betsy DeVos, the current U.S. Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, should begin looking to see if this same philosophy, the same ideology is being used across the United States, school districts across the United States. I think it is. I think that, there's a financial incentive driving this as well. The Obama administration gave Broward County $53 million in a grant 2 weeks after it renewed its pledge to the Promise program in October of 2016. And this was typical of the Obama administration. They would dangle financial incentives for school districts to sign on to Common Core, to sign on to, Race to the Top, and now to sign on to the Promise program, in order to convince school districts to go along with their sort of what I believe are kind of harebrained utopian social engineering schemes like the Promise program of, giving kids mentoring instead of arresting them for the activity that they should be arrested for. In order to incentivize them, they dangle this carrot of money, of federal monies, to the school districts.
And and that is all stuff that we're going to continue to look into, because I think that you're hitting on some interesting points about what might help explain why the sheriff's office was acting the way that it was, why it was just ignoring such clear signs that there was something really wrong going on here. Is that there was some sort of overall policy that may have been in place that was just this is the way that we do things. We don't want to arrest too many people, and that just seems to have happened in his case. Right, and it also makes the school districts look better, right? If they're not arresting people, well, it looks like Robert Runcie performing a miraculous job as the superintendent of the school district in Broward County to have brought the number of in-school arrests down 66% in the span of 1 year. Wow, he must be a phenomenal manager. No, it's that you change the goalposts effectively. You change the policies by which people are arrested. And what's the end result? You end up with a mass shooter who should have been arrested a long time ago and imprisoned, or he should have been institutionalized. You had, under the Baker Act in Florida, people who are demonstrating behaviors that show that they are either a threat to themselves or a threat to others can be involuntarily examined for mental issues and involuntarily committed. This kid in September of 2016 was cutting his arms and posting images of his cut arms, I believe on Snapchat. Mm-hmm. And this was brought to the attention of the authorities, I believe of the Broward County Sheriff's Office. On that basis, he should, I would think, have been examined and possibly committed, which would also, an involuntary commitment to a mental hospital is also grounds
for denying someone the ability to purchase firearms. That could have stopped them as well. This is another in the sort of systemic failures that we're seeing in this case.
So let's talk about what the end result of that was. The end result of all of these failures, ignoring all of these warning signs, seemingly purposefully, was that this shooting occurred. And then you had a number of failures that occurred during the shooting, which we'll, if we could, just touch on them briefly. The response that the sheriff's office had during the shooting. There was an armed school resource officer on site, and then other police showed up as well. Let's touch briefly on kind of what their response was here.
Yeah, I used to work in the law enforcement community, and I have a lot of sympathy for law enforcement officers. I have relatives who work in law enforcement. I understand you have to make split-second decisions as a law enforcement officer. With that caveat, what this officer did, Scott Peterson, about whom I'm also looking into trying to get records about, was, to my mind, just on the face of it anyway. We'll learn more as the Florida Department of Law Enforcement investigates what happened, the circumstances of the shooting more. But on the face of it, it looks unconscionable. Truly looks reprehensible. If you're armed, even if I was a civilian and I was armed, and I heard multiple gunshots going off in a school, I would like to think that my conscience would not let me to just stand outside and do nothing. Now, he claims, I like to think, again, I don't know how I would be in the heat of the moment, but I would like to think I would rush into that building. He claims, in a recent press release by his attorney, that he wasn't sure where the shots were coming from. He thought they were outside. Well, I still don't understand that reasoning. You want to go to the shot. First thing you want to do is go to where the students are, just inside the building, and you would see a rush of students coming at you, and you would just ask them, where is this guy? Who's shooting? And they would point you to him. And this is not rocket science, right? It's just basic police work. So, and ever since Columbine, my understanding is that school districts, police forces are trained in active shooter situations to go immediately to the source, not to wait, not to set up a perimeter, a cordon, and wait for backup. That's no longer the operating principle. It was, pre-Columbine, and that's kind of, so you can kind of almost forgive in some ways maybe the reaction of the police officers at Columbine, because it was a fairly new situation. They were operating on old law enforcement principles. But after Columbine, that was no longer operative. So he should have, even as a single officer, he should have gone in. He was armed. He was wearing a bulletproof vest, which is more than the football coach who defended his children, who put himself in between Nicholas Cruz and his students. It was that football coach showed real heroism. Aaron Feist,
Coach Feist, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to mention his name. I mean, truly what all Americans, I think, should aspire to be, right? Or hope that they would do in a similar situation. So to see him without a gun, without a bulletproof vest, taking rounds that officer, Scott Peterson, should have been reacting to, is just reprehensible to my mind. But, all of that will be sorted out, and clearly everyone is piling on him. So at this point, and there's really no point. But so we see all these failures both before the shooting, where this kid should have been identified and stopped, and during the shooting, and then of course you have the reports of 3 other deputies from Broward County apparently, shielding themselves behind their police car without going into the building. And
setting up some other sort of perimeter instead of going in right away.
Right, and the Coral Springs police, apparently from what I've read, were shocked at the reaction of these deputies, and of course they rushed in. And by the way, I am seeking records from the Coral Springs Police Department regarding their communications about Sheriff Israel, who's a real winner. I mean, this guy's a prize, right?
Well, he was the sheriff that in the CNN town hall that they had was sort of berating the NRA and that sort of thing. While the same day he admitted later in an interview that he had knowledge about everything that we now know about his officer not going into the building, not trying to stop the shooting. He knew about that. He says in a later interview he knew about that, but didn't really disclose it during the town hall. Disclosed it later in an interview when he talked about it. So so this is the kind of leadership that you're dealing with there. I think a telling quote from him was that in the interview with Jake Tapper on Sunday, Sheriff Israel said that he demonstrates amazing leadership at the Broward County Sheriff's Office. And after everything that we've kind of gone through right here, it's kind of a stunning statement to hear.
Yeah, it really was. Jake Tapper, to his credit, I'm not a huge Jake Tapper fan, but to his credit, he really held Sheriff Israel's feet to the fire in that CNN interview. And as you say, the quotes are pretty stunning. It's Sheriff Israel. He says something to the effect. I may have the quote right here, or I may not, but. He says that I can give, I'm not. He essentially says I am not at fault for this. I can give a man a badge and a gun and the training, but it's up to him to do his job. Now that's pretty much the antithesis of what a leader is. A leader steps up to the plate, assumes responsibility for the actions of his employees. He was responsible for hiring the right people. If Scott Peterson was not the right person for whatever reason to be the school resource officer at Marjorie Douglas Stoneman High School, then it was on Sheriff Israel for hiring him and putting him in that position in the first place. And then to have 4 of his deputies apparently not respond in a way which most law enforcement officers, I think, would respond to that situation really begs the question, what were the policies in place to active shooter scenarios in Broward County? And in fact, I just got those from Broward. They've been very responsive. I sent a FOIA request asking for all their training materials in response to active shooter situations. I just literally received them, and I'll be reviewing those today to see what it was that these guys are being taught, because it sure isn't what I would think would be applicable in this day and age, in responding to active shooters in school classrooms.
Yeah, and I one final telling quote, and then I do want to talk a little bit about the FBI's response to this as well. But a telling quote from that interview was how to measure leadership is. Tapper said maybe you should measure somebody's leadership by whether or not they're protecting the community. Mm-hmm. And that seems like maybe sort of what it should have been the ultimate goal, although it's based on all of the red flags and warning signals that were being ignored. It seems like that wasn't necessarily the goal here. That's
a great point. Were these people driven by processes, policies, processes, overly driven, rather than common sense? Looking at this situation in toto, you have to wonder, what were all these people thinking? Everybody, that this kid was not institutionalized, was not arrested, was able to buy these firearms. Was everyone so sort of hidebound by now, policies are necessary and regulations, I understand that. But when you have someone who's so self-evidently a threat, able to reach this point where he could carry this atrocity out, and then to see these deputies not going into the school, is all of this due to regulation, over-regulation, and not giving people, the basic tools they need to prevent something like this? Yeah. I find it just remarkable on so many levels.
It is. It's stunning. And let's talk briefly about the FBI's, it seems, minimal involvement in this, but also critical involvement, right? The FBI got, as far as I can tell, got 2 different warnings themselves about Nicholas Cruz. In September of 2017, they were alerted, I believe, about something to the effect of a threat that he had made on YouTube, on a YouTube comment under his own name, saying he wanted to be a mass shooter. And then In January 2018, they received a call to their public access line from someone basically who had knowledge about him, personal knowledge, saying that they thought he was going to be a threat. So talk with me briefly about those two instances and whether the FBI's response was appropriate there.
Right. And this is actually a great example of how citizens, step up and, do their job. They see something, say something. The comment that you're referencing is from September 27th was made as a post on a YouTube video that someone in Mississippi had produced. I don't recall what the video was about, but Nicholas Cruz said, "I want to become a professional school shooter," words to that effect. The citizen who owned the YouTube account very conscientiously notified he notified the FBI saying, I think you got to look into this guy. He made this comment on my YouTube site. Well, apparently the FBI did, to its credit, then interview the guy who owned the YouTube account. They had the actual name with the unusual spelling of Nicholas. He actually used, Nicholas Cruz used his real name as the handle for his YouTube account. But they never took it any further, apparently, right? Now, from what I understand, in listening to Joe DeGenova, the former U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, he made some interesting observation, as did Ron Hosko, the former Assistant Director of the FBI. He said the FBI agents are sort of hidebound, and this goes again to the issue of regulation and policy. They have to adhere to what's called the Domestic Investigations Operations Guidebook. That's the DIOG, right? That's sort of the Bible of FBI agents. It dictates at what point they can open up an investigation, that they can conduct an assessment or a preliminary inquiry or on up to a full-blown investigation. And, Ron Hosko said that that may have been the reason why the FBI didn't inquire of Google, who owns YouTube, apparently didn't attempt to get more information about the account holder, Nicholas Cruz. Presumably, if they had taken that step, it would have led to Nicholas Cruz in Florida. Now, the second issue is even more serious. This is the tip from a close family member of Nicholas Cruz who called the public access line, the FBI hotline in January, a month before the shooting, January 2018, and said this kid Nicholas Cruz is behaving erratically. He has guns. He's sort of obsessed with guns. He's talked about killing people, and he's even talked about shooting up a school, and yet apparently nothing was done with that information.
And by nothing, I believe you literally mean nothing. I don't. As far as the FBI's statement and everything like that, it doesn't seem like anything was done with the report at all.
From what I've seen in public reporting, nothing was done, and I think the FBI has come out and admitted that. Which so it begs the question: well, if you encourage people through public service announcements and whatnot, whether about terrorism or anything else, that if you see something, say something, well, that presumes that there will be some kind of follow-up by the people you're saying something to, the law enforcement authorities. Well, if nothing happens, then, this is what we at Judicial Watch sort of focus on, And as I say at the beginning of my article, the cascading failures of government at American Thinker is that what leftists in general try to do is to usurp the authority, the sovereignty of citizens in favor of the sovereignty of the state. And what ends up happening inevitably are disasters like this, because people who work for the state, they're bound by regulations, which again, I understand are necessary to some degree, but they become so bound by those regulations that, and policies, frankly, like the Promise program, the Obama, the vaunted Promise program, which was, sort of created out of this skewed racial lens where, you want to reduce the number of kids going from school to prison because 70% of them are Black or Latino, and there's some sort of, I think, perverse racial outlook in that, when in fact there is not. It's just based on the activities of these kids that's resulting in them going into the prison system. But So it's a combination of the growth of sort of a disinterested state with massive regulations, with bizarre social engineering motivated concepts like the programs like the Promise program that results in disasters like this. And
we've seen, just to close it out, we've seen sort of these similar type errors occur with the FBI before. Of course, the FBI prevents a lot of attacks and they do a lot of good work, but there's also these sort of big errors that have been made with Dylan Roof, with problems with the FBI's background check, Omar Mateen, with the FBI investigation into him, the Fort Hood shooter having knowledge about his communications with Anwar al-Awlaki, one of the Tsarnaev brothers having prior knowledge about his potential proclivity towards this sort of thing. I mean, this is a bit of a recurring problem in these big events. Is a lot of the time you see that in some way the FBI may have dropped the ball.
Yeah, and again, I can't emphasize this enough. I'm a great fan of law enforcement and the military. I mean, I don't mean to condemn with too broad a brush.
Right.
All FBI agents. Most of them, probably, certainly the majority of them are doing yeoman's work in trying to protect us. Okay.
Absolutely.
But yes, one of my pet projects at Judicial Watch is creating a sort of a history of FBI failures, and I've sort of, as time permits, I research the FBI and the sort of, the mistakes that occur. Now, the FBI is populated by people. People are, we all make mistakes. You have, everybody does, and you don't want to, condemn an entire organization because occasionally mistakes happen. But the problem comes in, I think, when there's a sort of an arrogance, by people who run these large organizations, when they sort of suggest that they are above reproach or above, condemnation, and will not admit to the mistakes they make. And we have seen the FBI cover up. This is not, like all human, all organizations comprised of human beings, they don't like to admit their failures. So we really have to push, I think, our law enforcement organizations to be transparent, to be upfront when they make mistakes. Because I think the only thing worse than in some of these really glaring mistakes we see, like the tip that was sent in January to the FBI hotline and Nicholas Cruz, is trying to cover up those mistakes. And to their credit, I will say the FBI came out fairly quickly and said, "Yeah, we messed up."
Yeah. And we'd like to see more of that, but also hopefully they start to learn from the mistakes that they're making there. Would you, just to close out here, would you be able to share the different pieces of information that you kind of are requesting right now, so that Judicial Watch can kind of get a bigger, the full picture on what happened? Sure.
Now, a lot of the things I've asked for will probably be withheld because there are exemptions in both federal law, federal FOIA law, and the Florida Sunshine Act, which is their equivalent of the FOIA, the FOIA law, which prevent them from releasing information, pertaining to active law enforcement investigations. So some things I've asked for, like, for example, I've asked for communications between the deputy Scott Peterson, who was the school resource officer, his communications with his superiors, with other officials within Broward County Sheriffs Office. Those are being withheld from me, citing, the Sheriff's Office has already cited the active law enforcement investigation exemption, so they won't release those. But I've also asked for his personnel file, as I'm sure other people have, and they'll be sending me that. I've asked for Sheriff Israel's personnel file. I've asked for his communications with on the day of the shooting with everybody. I've asked for his communications with Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Ted Deutsch, with whom I understand he is very friendly. They are of similar mind politically. He, as evidenced from the CNN town hall, he's a rabid, it seems, gun control advocate. So I want to find out. So I've asked for his communications with gun control organizations like, Handgun Control Inc. and all these others, to see what he's been talking about. I've asked for, as I mentioned earlier, the training materials that are used to train Broward County Sheriff's deputies in active shooter scenarios. I've asked for, from the Coral Springs Police Department, I've asked for the police chief's communications about Sheriff Israel and with Sheriff Israel. I've asked for the mayor's communications. I've asked for the city manager's communications, because all of these people, according to public reporting, that is the Coral Springs officials, were livid at the reaction by the Broward County deputies to this shooting incident. I will be asking the Department of Education for communications between Arnie Duncan and Robert Runcie. I'll be asking for Superintendent Runcie's communications. So I'm trying to blanket sort of blanket the issue by getting as many records as we can, which is what Judicial Watch does. I think the government, you can say what you want, but they're great record keepers. The government, like governments everywhere, they're paperwork oriented, which is why the Freedom of Information Act is such a vital tool to the American people, and to the accountability that we can hold government officials in.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Bill. I think you gave some great insights there and helped show that this was just a failure on so many different levels, so many different, bad policies implemented, important policies ignored, red flags ignored, a lot of problems. And as you said there, Judicial Watch is going to do everything that we can to try and paint the full picture, because the ultimate goal here needs to be what happened and how do we make sure it doesn't happen again.
Exactly.
So thank you very much for being with us today, Bill. And thank you for joining us. As you can tell, we are trying to do everything that we can to get to the bottom of what happened, how it happened, and how it can be prevented in the future. You can count on Judicial Watch to get to the bottom of this. And I encourage you to continue to follow our work. Follow us at judicialwatch.org on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Instagram. Until next time, I'm your host, Jerry Dunleavy, for Inside Judicial Watch. Thanks for joining us.